Hello, my Intro to Literature class. We are on week 5 of our journey through the ages this week, and we are entering a really exciting time in history known as the Renaissance. So, last time we were all together, we were in the Middle Ages and we were studying Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which was around 1400 AD. So, we're fast forwarding, if you guys know what that means, to the late 1500s for this week. And this was right in the middle of a time that Europe called the Renaissance, which some of you, I think, know means rebirth. And it was called this because the nations of Europe had begun to develop their own really strong cultural identities. It had been quite a while since they were under Roman rule at this point. So they had kind of settled and established themselves and were now very interested in learning new things and creating things and studying the arts and the sciences and literature. And so there was just a big revival. There was a big comeback of learning and of creativity. And I always thought this was a super fascinating time. But one of the key figures of the Renaissance that made it the Renaissance is a poet and playwright that I think you've probably heard of before by the name of William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare is often also known as the Bard. And if some of you may remember, we talked about the Bard when we were talking about oral tradition way back when, about how cultures would tell their great stories and they would remember them and they would pass them on. And that sometimes, like maybe in the Beowulf Mead Hall situation, there would be somebody named the Bard who would remember all the stories of all the culture, and then they would entertain and they would tell the stories with great skill, and that would be the Bard. So Shakespeare, that was his nickname, the Bard, because he came up with all of these great stories that reflected the culture and people of the time. And he wrote 37 plays and over 150 sonnets, and we continue to celebrate, perform, learn, and recite his work today. And actually, this week you'll be learning to recite a portion of one of his plays. So a lot of people wonder, and you might be wondering, students or parents, we'll talk more about the why later, but we'll do a little bit of why now, and we'll do some why from a Christian perspective at the end. But why do Shakespeare's works continue? Why do we still think they're great today? And there are so many reasons for this. Honestly, I'm just going to give you my opinion. I believe that he had just an incredible grasp of human nature. In his plays, he shows a huge amount of depth, from existential crisis, like in Hamlet, to be or not to be, as in, what am I doing here? What am I doing here on the planet? What's the value in me being here? So questions like that, to what it feels like to fall in love, to humor and comedy that still makes us laugh today, to tragedy that can make us weep even almost 500 years later. He just had a really solid grasp on humanity and on the things that still speak to us today. So that's one reason. And another reason that I think his works stand out is that he was a true master of a certain type of pattern in language that you can hear with your ears. So students, I know that when you think of poetry, you might think of things that rhyme. And we will do some poetry like that in this course. We're going to do some more poetry as we continue on. But there are other patterns of language in poetry that don't have to do with rhyme. They have to do with meter. And when you think about meter, you can think about something metrical. Like if you've ever heard of a metronome, some of you that play music, the metronome keeps the rhythm. And so there's a rhythm in language too that has to do with things beyond rhyme. And the rhythm, or the pattern that Shakespeare was really well known for, is called iambic pentameter. So say that at home. Iambic pentameter. Now there are two parts to this phrase. Iambic has to do with a pattern of sound that is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Now you might be going, what does that mean? I know we talked about this in class, but let's just talk about it. Actually, take the word about. Say it, about. About. All right, now you all know what syllables are. So the word about has about 2 syllables. But one is stressed and the other is unstressed. Which one do you linger on more when you're saying that word? About. It's the second part, about. You wouldn't say about. You say about. Is 1 syllable and about is 1 syllable, but is just shorter and it's not stressed. About is the one that we emphasize. So about is an example of an iamb, an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Now, iambic pentameter, penta means 5. So iambic pentameter means we have 5 pairs of iambs. And you can think about it sounding like this. When we do an iamb, I want you to think about what a heartbeat sounds like. If you've ever listened to a heartbeat. Bum bum, bum bum, bum bum, bum bum. It's basically an iamb. It's 2 sounds. They're both units of sounds, one slightly shorter than the other. But bum. So when we think about iambic pentameter, I want you to think about that pattern 5 times, and we can clap it out. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Now that pattern of sound is iambic pentameter, and it's what Shakespeare used in writing all of his poetry and his plays too. And sometimes he would break the rules, but honestly not very often. And whenever he did break iambic pentameter, there was always a really good reason for it. An example of iambic pentameter that you probably have heard comes from Romeo and Juliet. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks. Now, when we read Shakespeare aloud, we're not going to read it like that. We're not going to read it like, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks. But you could read it that way. And honestly, that you want to soften your reading out loud so that it's not so harsh on the iambic pentameter, but it can help you remember it. There's a pattern in the language that just rolls off the tongue very naturally. And so that's something we're talking about in class, and we might try to practice if there's time, but continue to think about it and talk about it at home. And now let's move on to talking about the piece that we're working on this week. The speech we will be doing and learning this week is often called Portia's Speech, and it is from a play called The Merchant of Venice. And this play has to do with justice and mercy, and so does the speech. So it's a nice little kind of microcosm within the play. And in this speech, a man has been charged with something that he did do wrongly, but the punishment is far too high and would cost him his life for such a minor infraction. And then we have our heroine, Portia, who comes into the picture. And Shakespeare had a lot of great female heroines, by the way. He's kind of known for that. And he also has a lot of disguises. So Portia disguises herself as a lawyer and comes to the defense of this man and essentially says, you're right, this would be justice, but mercy is also really valuable. To be merciful is to be like God. So that is the premise of the speech, and I'm going to do my best to recite it for you. And I will keep working on it this week as well, but I also want your students to work on it every day a little bit. They have a lot of details about this in their homework, but there's a place, parents, for you to sign every time they read it to you or recite it to you aloud. Okay, I'm going to breathe. Breathing is important, especially when you're reciting things. Okay. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven. Upon the place beneath it is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, an attribute of awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy sits above the sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute of God himself. An earthly power doth then show likest gods, when mercy seasons justice. And that's the section we'll be learning together and we'll be practicing throughout the week. We're going to talk about it in class a little bit more and what it means and break it down. Continue to feel free to do that at home as well. But we are getting closer to our modern English, which I know is cool to see. Students got to see a bit of Old English and a bit of Middle English, and now in Shakespeare we can see that this language we can understand better. But anyway, I love that speech. I hope your students enjoy it, and you do too. One last thing. This is a question I know many people have, and especially from a Christian perspective, perhaps. Why does it matter to study Shakespeare? Why is it important? And we always talk about a why in our class that kind of ties it back to our themes of our journey and the great conversation. I always say that great literature helps us understand ourselves better as human beings. It helps us understand God better, and it can help us understand our relationship with Him. So I think that's when we look at Shakespeare, we see a master wordsmith, someone who has a deep understanding of the logic, the music, the patterns of language, but also the beauty and just the power of speech, the power of the written word. And, I already said Shakespeare had a great understanding of what it means to be human. Reading his works can help us understand ourselves and our fellow man much better. So that's one very important why to read Shakespeare. Obviously, the fact that his works have continued to endure for 500 years should tell us that they matter. But then another thing that kind of struck me this week as I was thinking about this is that we serve a God of logic, of patterns, of mathematics, of music, and we serve a God of emotion and beauty and craftsmanship and creativity. And those are things, the order and the beauty that is poetry. Poetry is order and beauty, I'd say just about equally, is something that we've inherited from our Creator. We are made in His image, and yes, we are flawed and fallen, but our desire to create beautiful things does come from Him. And our desire to have order comes from Him too. And also, how did God create the world? What did He use? He used words. So our desire to communicate with words also comes from Him. So if you've never thought about Shakespeare or poetry in that way, this is something that is like a growing soapbox for me. God is just speaking to me through poetry lately, and I think this is just really important as we study poetry to remember why it matters and what it can show us about our Creator and about ourselves. So with that, I will leave you this week, and I will see you next week for week 6.